Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I am joined by a very special guest because we're going to be talking about House of Chains. We're going to be talking, this full spoiler talk. And I'm joined by Christian from Dark Portents, the YouTube channel, but also, is it Jasna as a boy on
Yasna as a boy, yes.
Yasna as a boy on the Legendarium Green Team podcast? So multiple hats, multiple names.
When I picked that Discord name, I didn't expect it to be what I got called on a podcast. And now that I'm doing the YouTube thing, like they want me to keep it for continuity. So I'm just kind of trapped with two different discontinuity for me, continuity for them.
And for all of those people on the Malazan subreddit who complain about why does Erikson have all of these characters who have different names? Hello, look at Christian, who's Dark Portents, and Yasna as a boy.
I honestly never thought of it that way.
So we're having this chat today about House of Chains because this is your first time through the book, and we just had the non-spoiler discussion on your channel. So because this is about your first read through, and you said something quite controversial. Well, is it controversial? But you preferred this to Dead House Gates, and because this is almost like the conclusion of that story, why do you feel that this book is so much better than Dead House Gates? Because Dead House Gates for me is one of the most emotional books in the series.
So I don't necessarily feel it's so much better than Dead House Gates. It's hard to separate them, and it's hard to rank them because everything that I love about this book that makes me say this is my favorite book I've ever read is payoff, emotional payoff for the trauma that the characters in Dead House Gates went through, both in the Chain of Dogs and the trauma that Felison, Elder or Shaik, went through in Dead House Gates. So it's not necessarily, oh, this is so much better than the other, but I feel rewarded, especially having gone through Dead House Gates 3 times, which got me particularly attached to Felison and also to the plight of the Wiccans and the refugees in the Chain of Dogs, and the heartbreak that you experience in Dead House Gates, and that Erikson through Dulker at the end of Memories of Ice tells you is important, is dealt with both in terms of answering it with the Chain of Dogs, but you also get sort of the conclusion of the heartbreak with the Felison and Tavor relationship, or at least a conclusion. Tavor's still alive, she could still have thoughts about it, and the impact could still continue, but you get a conclusion to that heartbreak.
Well, you get a conclusion to Felison's arc.
Right.
a fairly pointed conclusion.
Yes.
And one of the things that I liked about it is, and it's something that Erikson and I discussed in that video, is that this is a very cathartic tragedy. That it's not often tragedy's fallen out of favor as a narrative form, and to see Tavor kill Felison without knowing it was her sister, but also to have it from Felison's perspective, where she's left by the goddess, she is suddenly back to herself, suddenly in control of herself, suddenly connected to all of these things, sees her sister, and there's this fractional opportunity for a meeting of the two of them, a resolution where they can hug it out, where they can cry, and Tavor can explain her plan of why she did the thing to Felison that she did and what went wrong, and that she was sorry that it happened the way that it did. And Felison could cry and rail and bang her shoulders and say, I suffered all of these things because of you. And there was potential for healing and for the two of them to be together and have that return to family. All of that potential in a split second. And then it's torn away. And that tragedy.
Because she raises her sword and doesn't realize how it's going to look. and Tavor just responds quickly and brutally.
And it just, that tragedy, the brutality of it, I thought was enormously impactful, and I thought it was a fantastic way to conclude that arc, because Felison's story was a tragedy. We don't know, you don't know yet, what Tavor's story is going to be. It certainly has obviously this tragic element in it now, but you don't know the conclusion of Tavor's story. You don't know if it is going to be a classic tragedy or a classic comedy. You don't know yet, but we know that this is possible, that it could be tragic. And that is an element added into a 10-book series to go, yeah, these things do not necessarily work out. And that is a wonderful gut punch as a reader to go, this is, even if you were in any doubt up to this point, this is not a traditional fantasy where everything's going to work out in the end and there'll be some sacrifices made along the way, but in the end, yay, that's not guaranteed to happen here, folks.
Right. And, given that we don't get that in Dead House Gates either. We get the long, arduous struggle of the Chain of Dogs to reach the city of Arin. And in a traditional fantasy book, that would end with the refugees being successfully rescued and, the battered legions or tribes of Coltane's Wiccans and of whatever the number of the army that it was that he was leading, or the armies, they would make it into the gates of Arin after going through all of these horrific things. And the author tells you from the beginning of the Chain of Dogs that they're not going to make it. It's said again and again and again and again, and you still believe, because in a traditional fantasy, they tell you they're not going to make it over and over, and then they make it. You still believe this up to the very end. So with the ending of the Chain of Dogs in mind, with the way that that Dead House Gates ended with Kalam's story, with all of these things in mind, my expectation for Felison and Tavor meeting was that Felison would be killed by Tavor. This was one case where, there was no subversion of my expectations, and I was completely fine with it. Like, not everything has to be subverted. You can pay it off, and it can work. And I loved it. And it was
the subversion there is not necessarily that, Felison was going to survive. That is obviously one way it could have ended, Felison dying another way. But the subversion of building up to what we think is going to be a big military conflict, and then
yes.
the ghosts, because of the Tano spirit song and the ghost of Raraku rising up to cleanse Raraku so Raraku can reclaim itself. That is a subversion of the expectation that all of these fantasies are going to end in big battles.
Right. Yeah, and again, perfectly foreshadowed throughout the book. You're told right out the gate that Coltane is with the 14th Army, that they're walking with the Chain of Dogs. It's established that that Bent and Roach are following the caravan, or the traveling army. Like, it's established that the ghosts of the Chain of Dogs are with them so many times. And you don't take it literally when you think of it metaphorically, and then the subversion is, it was literal. And they're here now to answer for the crimes of the Dog Slayers.
And of course, that relates back to in Dead House Gates, the Oxbow Crossing, where the undead rise up to fight to protect Coltane's army. Like, we've already seen this happen, and now we see it on a different scale.
Right. Another thing I really appreciated about this was the completion of the story with the Tano Spirit Walker. Because when we read that on the green team, we were like, oh, he touched his shoulder. he's making that song. And then you get it again in Memories of Ice, where Perrin does his blessing, and then he leaves the tomb. And then after he leaves the tomb, there's just a camera in the room, and there's like this glow that comes about. And you think that's Kimlock. That's something with Kimlock and Perrin's blessing combining, and we're gonna get the ascendancy of the bridge burners, right? And then finally here you get the conclusion of that, of a plot that maybe some readers didn't even know was going on through book 2 and 3, but that I'd been on the lookout for, of like, how does this gonna resolve? Because we'd been like, we're kind of conspiracy theorists over on the green team. Like we put on our tinfoil hats and try to draw lines between all the different subplots and what might be subtextually going on. And so we've been on this Tano thing for 2 books now, trying to figure out where it's gonna go.
But and that's one of the fascinating things I think about all of this is every character in the Malazan Book of the Fallen thinks of themselves basically as the hero of their own story. And we hear people say that everyone always considers themselves the hero of their own story, that we create these narratives around ourselves. And we actually see this, that narrative is very, very flexible, and depending on perspective, that's the story that's being told. But with the Malazan Book of the Fallen, because there are so many different perspectives, yes, the events are all the same, but what's important in that event for one person might be radically different to someone else, and they will see the event differently. It will have a different meaning for them. It will tie into their own personal narrative in a different way. And one of the fascinating things about this book series is that all of these different things are connected in a tapestry of story. That the idea that there's one central thread, or there's one way to look at it, or this is the main narrative, is ignoring the fact that this is part of a giant history of a world, and we're getting excerpts from it, we're getting perspectives of certain events of it, and it all actually fits into a giant narrative tapestry. And it's a fantastic thing to see, at least for me. I mean, I really enjoy it.
Yeah. And then another thing that I talked about a little bit in our non-spoiler discussion, but I can put some flesh on the bones now, is I loved how he opened up to like just throwing the D&D player's handbook and bestiary at us in this one. You get so much exploration of like fantasy creatures and different magic parts of the magic system. You get the fight on Drift of Volley, where the Teist are defending themselves from the Teist are defending themselves from the Teistidor, and then it ends with Dasim Ultor taking, or I assume it's Dasim Ultor taking the sword, Grief or Vengeance, and you have like the Odotarl dragon and a pocket warren, and there's just so much like over the top. You have the sky fortresses, and it's implied that the Kachin Shamal aren't even from this world, and there's just so much like play with like even the concept of time. Like the Kachin Shamala are only in here in a memory that people who use magic can walk into and go back into the past of Rariku and see what Rariku was like. But I mean, it's just so dense and deep and out there, like nothing I've ever read before. And he really just kind of upped the ante on all of these fantastic elements.
But that's when people read Memories of Ice and they're like, giant lizard dinosaur things with swords for arms, like what the hell? And it's one of the things that impresses me about what Erikson and Essamon did in creating this world, and obviously like it was helped with all of their gaming sessions with their friends, like they developed it, they refined it. None of the elements feel like you go, that doesn't make any sense, it doesn't fit. All of these elements actually seem to fit. That there aren't these sharp edges where you go, you've you've just stuck in a Roman analog and dropped it in there, and then you've gone, you know what, I need a couple of, yeah, we're just going to stick in dragons here, and even though it doesn't seem to fit with the world, everything seems to fit into the world, that they seem integrated, and they're part of the history. They're part of the story world and the world building.
Right, right. And also it defies the notion that not only can you not have all of these really different and alien cultures and creatures and all of this and it be integrated into the world, but it's not the sole you know, it's not solely pulp fiction that can have these things, because typically if you're going to have that many different fantasy creatures and that many different cultures all meshed up together in one world, you're thinking something like the Forgotten Realms or like Dragonlance, you know, and you have this world that's like that, but it's written with the seriousness of like Shakespeare or Homer, but writing all this like really out there fantasy stuff that you find in pulp. And it's a you know, not that there's no pulp, not that there's no serious literature that has these things, but you know, it's like not maybe as diverse and as like there's not as much of it necessarily in a lot of the more serious fiction you read. There might be dragons in this book, or this book might have orcs and goblins and elves and dwarves, but there's so much packed in here that you really don't get outside of pulp fantasy very often, at least that I've read. And it works as serious literature. Sorry,
yeah, and one of the things, yeah, okay, so people talk about the complexity of Malazan and they talk about the seriousness of Malazan, and you know, you've just compared it to Shakespeare and Homer, but the absurdist humor in it, the silliness of it, the lightheartedness. Erikson, I think, balances that very well with a lot of the very serious and dark things that happen in the world. That it's well balanced. Like the scene with Joyful Union.
Yes. Oh, we had a spur of the moment discussion of that on the green team, where I brought it up and I was like, well, is there a metaphor in this scene for one of the themes in the book? And one of my co-panelists said, well, what if it's this? And that made me realize that you can actually see the entire ending of the 14th Army's arc and the thing with the chain of dogs in the Joyful Union scene, because you have the two scorpions together, and it looks for all the observers, it looks like the other two scorpions are like big and tough, and they're gonna beat this little bird shit scorpion that looks like a piece of turd. Basically, it's underwhelming. It's not, you know. And then you look at the armies, and you have the dog slayers and the other parts of the army of the apocalypse, and it's said over and over again, they have every advantage. They've chosen the terrain. They have the numbers. They the other army is untested, and they're outnumbered, and blah blah blah. And yet on both sides you get this feeling that the 14th Army is going to destroy the army of the apocalypse. Like, even as these people are saying this side has every advantages, you know, Shaik's saying that, and she's thinking, why do I know I'm going to lose? And the soldiers with the scorpion fight, they see that every advantage looks like it's with these other two scorpions, but they're like, we know Fiddler's up to something. We know that he's going to win. And when the two scorpions divide, and you realize it's a mating pair of scorpions that are united together, that's a metaphor for the fact that all along you think the 14th Army is crossing the desert, crossing the Seven Cities continent, but there's another army marching with it, the army of ghosts of the chain of dogs, and they split apart at the end, and they kill the dog slayers. It's the whole entire sequence is embedded in this really tongue-in-cheek, fun little scorpion fight. Have you ever thought about that?
I actually, to be honest, never considered that. But that's a really interesting reading of it, and I'm I'm genuinely going, huh? Never thought of it. That's actually quite cool. And, but this is what I love about poetic readings and looking at metaphors and things is taking something specific and then having a look to see if meaning can be attached or can it join to other parts to reveal things about it. And that's a perfect example of that. That's actually a really interesting reading of that specific scene.
I wonder if it was intentional on Erikson's part. I really want to ask him at some point.
Well, yeah, I'm sure at some point. I think he's doing an Ask Me Anything on Reddit at some point in November, I believe.
Okay.
Because that's when The God Is Not Willing is coming out in North America.
Okay.
But one of the things that I thought was really interesting about House of Chains was in Memories of Ice. There's a lot of discussion of why didn't the Allies all descend on Coral at the same time? Why didn't they just do that? And you go, well, for a start, if they were thinking solely of that one goal, you go, yeah, it makes perfect sense. You organize all your forces and you go in all at once, and yeah, you'd win the battle. But it's about competing interests because they are not a monolithic army. They are an army made up of different allies with different competing interests. And Lysine still wants to take Coral as a beachhead to resume her campaign. So the bridge burners had to go in first. Here we have exactly the same sort of thing happening to the army of the Apocalypse. Because, oh yeah, they have all of the numbers. And when you look at it from the Malazan perspective, it's the army of the Apocalypse. Oh my God, look at them, they're so powerful. But when you're in the army of the Apocalypse, there's Bidethal's faction, there's Loric's faction, there's that faction, there's that. Everything is split apart. There's all of this tension and political maneuvering. And they lose sight of, yeah, if they just focus on defeating the Malazans and go, yeah, that's what we're going to focus on, everything would have been fine. But they don't focus on that because they're all maneuvering for what happens after they've beaten the Malazans.
Right.
And that's the big thing. And we see how that causes them to fall apart. Just like we saw the cost of focusing on what happened after the Battle of Coral cost the Allies in their attack. So it's an interesting parallel.
And it's not a complete obliteration of the coalition in Memories of Ice, but you also have these cool-headed, or cold iron, as House of Chains would say, these cool-headed guys who have like an established tradition of leading these institutions that, that like have an embedded process of self-replication within them. So their coalition, it buckles and it takes damage in the end of Memories of Ice, but it's not complete obliteration. But in the Armies of the Apocalypse, you have this very chaotic hot iron, aside from Leoman, group of people who don't have established institutions, who are kind of like, the Dogslayers are kind of like a chunked out piece of the Malazan Empire, and then the like Bidethal and his like damaged women that he leads, his little cult. That's a completely different structure, and it's not really like worked in with the rest of the Armies of the Apocalypse in any institutionalized way. And they're all divided into these little tribes that are only united against the Malazans and have different goals. And you don't have sort of the established institutional memories that you have in Dujek's armies, that you have in with the Tai-Stand-D, who've been following Rake for hundreds and hundreds of years. Presumably Brood's army has an established tradition of being led by Brood, his coalition of forces that he's been leading in liberation struggles. I mean, the only hot iron in that, I don't know if there is any. Even Calor, who is sort of the monkey wrench in Memories of Ice, he's patient, calm, cool until the last moment. To the point where I was wondering if he was ever going to deliver on the betrayal he set up at the beginning of that book. But yeah,
Kalor is a very interesting figure.
he is. He is.
Um,
But yeah. So yeah, I take your point about the echo of the Memories of Ice coalition and the House of Chains coalition here, and the way that they fall apart because they're not just planning for tomorrow. They're trying to fight about what's going to happen on the next tomorrow.
yeah, but you see this with like great chess players. Great chess players are not looking at the next move. They are looking at 10 moves down the road. And the issue with that is, sometimes you miss the things that are closer because you're focused too far ahead. But that's what I find interesting about Memories of Ice. I know a lot of people really complained about why didn't they just do that thing? And you go, because from the Empire perspective, it made perfect sense to send the Malazans in early to take Coral and to establish a beachhead before Brood's army gets there. Because they assumed, wrongly as it turned out, that they'd be able to handle it. Because this was the bridge burners, well, at least the remnants of them. This was Dujek. They did have this power. They thought they could probably do it, but they underestimated the magical condor things. They underestimated the Kachian Chamal. They underestimated all of these things.
They also overestimated the desire of Rake and his coalition to actually contest their expansion into Coral, because they didn't have the viewpoint that the reader had of seeing Rake go, why not let him have it beforehand? So
and remember, this is all about Lucine trying to do these things and ordering her army, whose job it is to go run into the breach that I point you at and go and do the thing. And Lucine, what we have seen of her thus far is that she doesn't worry about spending people's lives. What we see different with Shaik's army, with the army of the apocalypse, is there isn't that singular figure directing a vision. You have competing visions, all trying to outmaneuver each other. And Drishna, the whirlwind goddess, is so far removed from it that she doesn't really care about the Malazans. She just wants to lash out at everyone. So she's not focused. There isn't a singular vision driving anything. And that lack of leadership allows for a lot of the political maneuvering, bickering, and power plays. And because they assume their superiority, because they assume they're going to wipe out the Malazans, and they could do it with half of their army gone, that's why they're so focused on trying to wipe each other out, and they take their eye off the ball.
Right.
So what did you think of what happened to Bidethel then?
Yeah, so that was I was unexpected, because often Malazan seems to emphasize, a certain amount of cultural relativism and a certain amount of moral relativism, and kind of showing you that like different people do different things for different reasons and blah blah blah. And here you get a pretty just desserts kind of answer that you might find in a grimdark novel to someone like Bidethal, where he has Karsa, rip the guy's junk off and put it in his mouth. and then he gets to and then he's not done with him. Then he gets to Hood's gates, and Hood's like, I have a team of demons that's going to torture you for all of eternity, even though Hood has not been shown, so far at least, to be kind of a vindictive or vengeful god. Hood so far been shown to be sort of a indifferent god, that kind of sees death as this inevitable thing. I mean, I don't know. I don't know Hood very well, but that's sort of the impression you get up to this point. And then you get the sense here that, well, even someone like Bidethal is too far for even Hood, and then it's kind of an answer to to the norm of relativism that is found in a lot of these novels, and the norm of like you should have compassion even for the bad guys and so on and so forth.
No, but it's for me, it's interesting in that it's not saying that cultural relativism or moral relativism is the right thing. And it's not saying that objective morality is the right thing. It's showing you all of these things and asking where you as a reader fall on this. Because we saw a lot of Karsa's society. We saw what they believed. We saw how their society was shaped in a certain way that behaviors that we find abhorrent, that we cannot agree with, are perfectly normal, rational, and expected within that society. And then we see Karsa's journey as he is experiencing the world, has his eyes opened to other ways of perceiving the world around him, what other cultural norms are, what all these other things are. And the more knowledge he gets, the more he recontextualizes what his society was doing. And it's not, I think, that Erikson is casting a very specific cultural relativism good, or objective relativism good, or sorry, cultural objectivism good. It's more, here are different ways of looking at it. If we can look at the T-Blor society and we can go, well, we're going to look at what their culture does, and that explains that. Why are we not applying that same rationale to what Bidethal does? Because from his culture, his perspective, what he is doing, it makes perfect sense to him. And it's because we find what he is doing so abhorrent that we cannot think of a way to justify it. And when we then think of how he is he punished by any of the other characters? Apart from, no, it's Karsa, the barbarian. None of the civilized characters do it. Leoric doesn't do it.
Right.
Felison doesn't do it. Hiboric doesn't do it. None of them act to stop Bidethal, because realpolitik, that the pragmatic concerns, they need him, they need this, we'll deal with it after we've dealt with the Malazans. Well, let's sort these things out first. Karsa rides in, he said, he did what? Right, done. That barbarism, that straightforward, simple, let's sort the problem out and do it this way, with a lot of dramatic irony. But, and as a reader, you're looking at going, yes, I'm glad that evil scumbag died. I'm glad that happened to him. You go, well, what happened to our much vaunted civility? Where's our civilization? Where's our demand that Karsa was actually in the wrong to murder him? That he should have imprisoned him. He should have been put on trial. He should have been put in jail.
Sure.
But we look at that and we're like, yes, our primitive need, our barbaric need for vengeance, for punishing the evil, comes to the fore. And that can't be Leoric. It can't be Hiboric. It can't be those characters, because that's not what they represent. It's what Karsa represents. And it's such a curious thing to see in the books, because Erikson is so careful to show us a lot of this stuff from multiple angles, and to show us similar or slightly divergent things that when you look at them structurally, or when you pare them back a bit, you see that they're addressing the same sort of thing, but from different perspectives, to allow us to think round it, to try and find where that line is for us, to ask, are there things that someone can do, but can they then change and for the rest of their life make up for it? Are there some things that no matter what good works they do for the rest of their life, they can never be forgiven? Is there a dividing line? Where is that line? And that's a really gray area. It's a really murky area. And Erikson doesn't give us a definitive answer. He asks us to think about it and to draw the line for ourselves.
Right. But he, but also, do you not think that that Erikson himself sort of drew a line by not giving us any insight into Bidethal by there being no voice that says, shouldn't we have compassion for this guy? That Erikson drew a line for, this message of compassion and empathy can only go so far, and it does not extend to someone like Bidethal.
Yeah, I think, but I don't like ascribing motivations to Erikson because I haven't spoken to him about this, but I think
I cheated. I have heard him say this was his response to cultural relativism. So there is
but
that.
I think there are some acts, there are some practices, there are some things that are done that no matter what society or culture you come from, you have to draw a line somewhere. And I think this is one of those lines. And I think the book makes it clear. But I think there are, I think there are competing political interests. And when it is happening, as it did in Shaik's camp, when it is happening to people you don't care about, that don't matter to your faction, that don't matter in terms of your plans and your power and your economy and what you want to do, as long as it's not happening to you and yours, I'll get to it when I get to it.
Right.
And it's not a priority. But Karsa walks into that and he goes, no, this, I will not stand for this. And he does something that the others should have done. So and that's why I find this interesting. We hold ourselves as a civilized, educated, responsible people. And we suffer from exactly the same feelings when it is not happening to us and ours. That we go, yes, we'll get around to dealing with it when it is more convenient. And the fact that this is occurring and being shown in an epic fantasy novel, in a type of story, a type of narrative where this issue is not generally addressed, where this issue is a major issue for the book. This is one of the things that Erikson does. And is it going to be upsetting for some readers? Yes. But what's the other choice? Well, not include it. Turn away from it the way that we do every day.
Right.
Karsa's mere existence challenges us to reassess what we think of about behavior and how much of our behavior is actually culturally dependent.
Right.
And what would happen when we step outside our culture and review it. And it is very difficult to do that. We see that within T-Blor society, that Karsa's father is about the only one who sees the lie of everything, and he is shunned for it. But right. Karsa, the grandfather, Beroth might be cynical, but he kind of just buys into it and goes, yeah, I'll just go along with it. And we can criticize Karsa and the T-Blor culture all we like. And then we have to realize that, do we have similar blind spots about our culture, about the things that we take for granted? When we have debates about certain changes in cultural practice or changes to laws, and people say, oh, we can't do that because it basically has always been this way. How can you, the change is bad. But we see with Karsa that you can learn, you can see other ways of doing things. And yet you can't always predict if the change is going to be good. But it's an interesting character because he challenges so many of our assumptions, not just about his behavior, but about our behavior.
Right.
But we've kind of drifted away from the point of me finding out, like, what is it about this book that you're actually enjoying?
I mean, what is it? I mean, there wasn't a thing in the book that I didn't enjoy, really. I love this. I love this book. I love the tragedy. I love the catharsis. I love the answering of the chain of dogs. I like the mystery of Tavor and like what she's thinking. I liked all the exploration of like what happened in the founding of the Malazan Empire, and I'm dubious about the idea. I forget which character floated this idea that Kellanved is working with the cults that are like worship the Azath houses. I forget what they're called.
The nameless ones.
The nameless ones. Somebody in the novel floats the idea that Kellanved was is working with the nameless ones, and that his goal is to just grab up all the power and then sit on it and do nothing to like change the entire structure of the way that gods and magic work in the world. And I think that's a very clever notion, but everything I've seen of Shadow Throne or Kellanved doesn't lead me to believe he's that kind of person. He seems to be rather focused on his own power, kind of vengeful. I don't get the impression that that's a. I mean, maybe I'm totally wrong. And in this series, you never know what your impressions of a character are going to be challenged. But I was not convinced by that speculation by that character that was Kellanved's motivation here.
But what about that scene with Cotillion and Kellanved over over Hall's body on Drift of Valley?
Is that the scene where they basically say we have to stop the Talon and preserve the Empire? Is that what you're talking about?
Where on Drift of Valley, after Cotillion has arrived and killed a whole load of the Teast Eater.
Mm-hmm.
And then he sends Crocus off with Apsalar. Apsalar's unconscious. That scene. But there is a scene with Cotillion standing over Hall's body, and Kellanved arrives behind him.
Yes. And
Kellanved talks about how many of their followers have to die. And he is visibly quiet and upset by the death of a friend.
Oh, that's true.
So how much of that ties into your perception of Kellanved?
Yeah, I didn't even think of that at the time. I don't know.
But bizarrely enough, I have a video on that particular scene. That scene, go back and have a look at that scene to see how Cotillion is being portrayed, and then see how Shadow Throne is actually being portrayed. Because if we think of a lot of the other scenes where he has been witnessed, there are quite often other people present where he is performing for an audience, where there's an external person. But this is a scene with it's just Kellanved and Cotillion in private.
Sure.
No one else there.
That's a good point. I mean, I've read a lot of Paths to Ascendancy at this point, so I also kind of have that to go on. But that is before Kellanved and Cotillion have been together for this long. So you could read those scenes as Kellanved performing for Cotillion. He doesn't seem very altruistic in those sequences either. but
Paths to Ascendancy is a long time before this book.
That's true.
But I think House of Chains is it's a fascinating novel because it does work as a duology with Deadhouse Gates. And it works as a starting point for how this is going to link into another aspect and forward momentum of the story. I think all of them actually work together very well, but in the points of connection, the linkages and the progressions are not the straightforward chronological sequencing that you get in a story being told to you. So it's the narrative structures, and obviously this is something I always go back to because it's kind of my thing that I spent a lot of time studying. But the narrative structures here are enormously complex, and it's wonderful teasing out these different lines and points of connection. So the Karsa introduction, which obviously occurs before a whole load of these sequences, we then, knowing where Karsa comes from, seeing that journey, we refer back to Deadhouse Gates, and we see how Leoman had dismissed him as a teenager. Oh, he's only 17 years old. Because Karsa acts like a teenager. Karsa never says that he is 17 years old.
Right.
In Deadhouse Gates.
Right.
Leoman says it about him. Leoman has an external
I honestly
perspective.
didn't remember Leoman said that about him.
But also remember when Leoman asks, like, what's the traditional way of saying goodbye? And it's like, was it may you kill 1,000 children?
Right.
And Leoman blanches, and you go, but these were two people who worked as bodyguards for Shaikh for a long time. Like, they sat all the time. And Leoman does not know Karsa. All of Leoman's impressions of Karsa, he has an external view of who he thinks Karsa is. But it's clear Leoman never bloody asked.
Right. We also get the impression that we get the story of the birth of humanity in this book, with Kalava and Onrak's children spreading throughout the world and multiplying endlessly. So that was an interesting little story about how Onrak and pushed Kalava out of the ritual, essentially fathered her children, and that became humanity.
And who tells you this story?
The goddess.
Which goddess?
The Apocalypse. The
one that's the one that's insane.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
So you're saying don't buy that, huh?
Well,
well, Onrak tells us part of the story. Onrak tells us part of it, and the goddess tells us the other part of it.
Onrak tells us a version of events that he remembers.
Right.
Because those events line up to something the insane goddess says, you believe wholesale what she said.
I don't necessarily believe wholesale anything anybody says in these books, but I only have the information I'm presented with to go on for now.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying to you. You've been presented with the information. Onrak tells you something, and he's subjective, so therefore he is an unreliable narrator. He may have misremembered things over time. He may be fudging the issue slightly, but he tells you something, and you sort of believe the majority of it. And then you use that to corroborate something that a character that you know is insane. This character says something. You have now repeated it going, oh, we found this thing out, because this insane character has said something, and you've gone, and that matches up to what Onrak said, so it must be true.
Although, well, there is, I have had it hinted at that this narrative may be BS, but we get the first part of this narrative in Gardens of the Moon, with Tool saying that humans are the children of the Talani Mass. So okay. It's been corroborated by multiple unreliable narrators at this point.
Now let me ask you something. Do we understand human evolution?
No.
So you think that humans are directly descended from the Talana Mass because in this narrative world it's that straightforward, or do you think it's likely to be more complicated given that this world was created by two archaeologists who are also anthropologists?
Almost certainly the latter.
I'm not saying one thing or another. I'm just asking you a question.
Well, yeah, but we have to be able to sort of we have to pick up on some of these things as we go and just see what we think about them, you know.
And that's understanding that it is narrative, understanding that it is flexible, understanding that some things may be metaphorical, some things may be literal, which, you know, we've talked about. Sometimes it's a literal thing that's happening, but and sometimes it's both literal and metaphorical at the same time. But in all of these things, yes, pay attention, sort of absorb it. But the idea that these things are rigid, that these are fact, that this is what this means in a single rigid sense, None of the first four books have had at their heart, this is fact and this is what has to make sense. None
Oh
of them.
no.
So, and yes, you do have to pay attention to things. Yes, you like absorb it and sort of put it in as part of this whole sort of tapestry. But expecting it, oh well, now we know this thing, and you go as soon as you start
Well, I didn't
assuming
say
that
the
you
word
know.
no. I didn't say the word no at first, at least. I said we got, because you don't know anything about these books. You can't say no
We
about,
got a version.
right.
There you go. Not we got the origin. We got a or an origin for.
Sure. Yeah, that's better.
And that
We
makes
also
it.
got an origin of the Talani Mas with going back farther with the what are they called? Aries?
Eris and Erisal.
Okay, Eris.
Hmm.
Uh
We all know that I mispronounce things on a regular basis.
sure. And the interesting sort of implication, I forget what narrator this comes from, that in Malazan that humans were domesticated by the hounds rather than the hounds being domesticated by the humans. And the sort of calling into question, maybe that's what happened in our world.
But Neil Gaiman has a Sandman story about the cats having domesticated humans.
That sounds right. That sounds right for cats.
But no, so are there any other parts of House of Chains that you want to talk about?
I mean, I really appreciated the romance between Lestari Yill and Pearl. I mean, also all their adventures just seemed like a really fun, like, let's see how all the world fits together. And like they go through all the different warrens, and you see a bit of the Leosin world, and you see more about of the Imperial Warren. And there's a lot to Lestara and Pearl's journey, but then it ends with this really nice romance that reminded me of my wife and I know that Erikson also used his wife and his banter as like some of the basis for it. So I
Well,
liked it.
and that's uh, if you ever meet authors, any author, they steal from the world around them. They are absolutely shameless. They steal from the world around them because everything filters into their brains, and
Right.
that's so we get to see parts of that, and yeah, it's we see it in some of the pairings where even if they were not gamed, I think because Erikson and Esselmont gamed so much together that they can imagine the other person as that, and so that helps them create that very easy sense of familiarity with these pairings. And Erikson brings in other people as well. So yeah, he borrowed some of the dialogue that he has had with his wife over the years, tweaked it a little bit to insert it into a fantasy world.
It works. It works. It was very relatable, especially the way that she kind of teases him and knocks him for a long time, and then when he finally listens to her, she goes, "Oh, you're actually going to do what I just said?"
I was going to say there's so many different dynamics in relationships that if every pairing was the same, it would just be boring and tedious to read. So it's nice seeing that level of variance.
Yes. Yeah. One of the things going in that to Malazan that I was told was that the romance is not written well, and I have to say that that's not true. I don't agree with it. It feels good to me.
Well, romance again, like so many of these things, and I hate to harp on about this, but expectations about how things should be on the page, expectations of how romance functions. The older you get, the the broader your experience of the world and the different types of relationships that you've had or you've seen people have, means that you're potentially less judgmental about this is how romance is meant to be portrayed, or this is how romance should be portrayed. That there are elements to having that worldly experience that you only get from time and traveling and mixing with the different cultures. That is obviously one of the central themes of Karsa's journey, that his transition from this is how the world is, very single-minded, narrow focus, and the relatively slow transition of him to exploring something new, in that he was made a slave, someone who was so arrogant, someone who was so close-minded, so focused, is beaten by humans, by border baseline, not special, not gods, not monstrous, not supernatural.
Yeah, they're just children.
Bunch of humans take him down, and he becomes a slave, and he suddenly sees slavery from that perspective. Then, you know, on his travels, he sees the rest of the world and sees that his concept of what the world is was so small. And then obviously this feeds into when he joins up with Leoman and spends all of that time with Leoman, Garden Shaik, and seeing this whole world and exploring that aspect of the desert. To then obviously in this book, we then have skipped forward to the end of that whole journey, and we see him go off now on something more. That this has been a long journey for Karsa to get to the point that he's actually a lot more flexible, and that is time, distance, experience, all of these things that we bring to our analysis or our appreciation of literature. It's all based on these things. And like, I'm not an expert on romance, as I think my wife would agree, but I think some of the romances, the romances depicted, I don't have a problem with. Are they how I would depict them? I don't know. I'm not an author. Have I seen them romances depicted better or differently in other works? Yes. Do they work for these books? Well, for me, they did. So, you know, it's a lot of that comes down to reader expectation and reader appreciation.
Right. Yeah. So is there anything else we want to talk about for House of Chains, or is this a good wrap up point?
We can wrap up here. So all that remains for me is say, Christian, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, AP.
And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.